I'm Neil Patterson. Welcome back to the Sky News Daily, once again coming to you from our offices in Westminster. Not quite the wee hours of the morning, but certainly a lot later than I would ever care to be in the office. The reason being, well, we've been holding on for the result of the vote for the Rwanda bill, a key piece of legislation for Rishi Sunak, a key piece of legislation for many within the Conservative Party. I'm starting to flag. However, thankfully, I am joined by the perpetual motion machine that is our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, to explain. Sam, just explain exactly what on earth have I been stuck in this office for the past 12 hours? What's just happened?
So Rishi Sunak has been trying to get through the House of Commons one of the most important pieces of legislation for his premiership, which is a bill to try and actually make flights from people who come to the UK illegally go to Rwanda, where they can be processed, stay, where they can maybe even forge a life. And what the bill that we've been talking about for the last couple of days in particular does is it tries to effectively stop people from appealing, reaching out to international courts in order to make sure that they don't claim that their human rights are being breached and be prevented from going. It's trying to sort of reduce appeals. It's trying to sort of streamline the process, because for years the government have been trying to get these flights off, and at every stage, domestic and international laws got in the way. This bill is trying to stop that.
The lefty lawyers and the European Court of Human Rights and so on and so forth. OK, so what actually just happened on the third reading of the bill? I mean, is it going to become legislation now? What were the numbers?
So for 36 hours there have been votes, a lot of them been on amendments, attempts to change the bill. They prompted really quite big rebellions in the kind of 50s and 60s of Tory MPs. Then tonight, at a little bit before 10 o'clock, we had this vote on the overall bill once more. A big moment of jeopardy for the Prime Minister, because all the opposition voting against it, and if 34, 35 Tory MPs voted against it too, the legislation would fall. His premiership would be in chaos. In the end, only 11 Conservative MPs voted against the bill.
You're going to have to explain that one to me. No, in fact, actually, before we do that, congratulations, Jack and Sam. Sorry, your erstwhile partner on your Sunday podcast. I mean, you pretty much called this in terms of the numbers, didn't you?
Yeah, it was only this Sunday, before all of the hype and all of that I said this.
If it gets on with it, I think there'll be less than 12 people voting against at third reading.
What I love most is you have that standing by
for the government, and they're not even
self-effacing is not something people often say. But look, there's a big.
And you're right.
But there's a big point here, which is we have spent 36 hours talking about a potential rebellion because. And I didn't see this coming. There are 65 Tory MPs willing to repeatedly go through the division lobbies to tell Rishi Sunak they absolutely don't believe in his plans. And we've seen that 4 or 5 times today and yesterday. But what we have seen right now, in the only vote that could have had a substantial impact or any impact at all, when the rubber hits the road and the consequences of defeat are serious, then that rebellion crumbles, and it's essentially a sixth of what we've seen up until this point, because it's election year and they decided that the political risk outweighed the policy necessity.
OK, hold on just for a second. What on earth has happened to the 5 families, that weird name that they gave to themselves, these 5 distinct groups of rebels within the party? I mean, on the basis of what we have seen tonight and on the numbers that I've got in front of me, yes, 320, no 276, which is pretty close to the second reading vote, actually, if I'm remembering correctly. On the basis of what we've seen tonight, the 5 families are nothing more than a glorified crew, to quote The Sopranos.
Yeah, no, there is no doubt that people who were sounding like they were the most kind of certain of rebels have gone through. So in total, 29 MPs, Tory MPs, didn't vote the way the government didn't want. Some of them were just not near Parliament because they were off doing other things. So Theresa May didn't vote because she was in Davos, for instance. But 11 Tory MPs voted against and a handful abstained. Those voting against included Suella Braverman and Robert Jenrick, who both resigned quite recently. One head of the 5 families, the sort of joint head, Danny Kruger and Miriam Cates. but broadly speaking, that was it. Take Jake Berry. He was the head of the ARG, one of the 5 families. He voted for it.
Yep.
Take John Hayes, the Common Sense Group head. He abstained. He sat on his hands. For all of the interviews, for all of the rhetoric, he did not join in the rebellion. And the argument goes... So I've been following the argument behind closed doors quite closely. And what was going on is there was a group of rebels saying, look, this isn't going to work, we've got to vote it down. But then there was a much bigger group of rebels going, we just can't plunge this government into chaos. We can't risk an early election. This bill takes us to a better situation than we were in before, even if we don't think it's going to work. We might as well take 2/3 of a win or 1/3 of a win rather than nothing, and stop, and not effectively collapse the government in our pursuit of our goal.
When you put it like that, it doesn't sound utterly insane. However, I will counter with, of the 3 people who resigned from government yesterday because they could not stand this piece of legislation, Brendan Clark-Smith, deputy chairman of the party, he voted for it. Jane Stevenson voted for it. Lee Anderson, another deputy chair of the party, at least had the good grace to abstain. I mean, if you've resigned from government over the quality of a piece of legislation, earlier on in this process than the third reading itself, when it's a committee stage. I mean, surely when you go through the division lobbies on the third reading, if it was enough to make you resign from your position, surely it's enough to make you say no.
I was a little bit surprised to see that the rebel whip, Jonathan Gullis, sat on his hands and abstained. And, some of them will have made the argument to others, or maybe just to themselves in the mirror, look, I'm withholding a verdict now because I can come back and be really tough in future. I don't think anybody now would believe that, because now this is the 3rd time we've watched this drama, whether it was with the Windsor Framework last spring, or whether it was before Christmas with the Rwanda policy, or whether it was the last couple of days. The ability of it's not a small number. 65 MP is a, there is no media outlet in Britain that wouldn't cover a rebellion of 65 MPs of the governing party ever. But the ability of them to raise something up the flagpole only for when the going gets serious, for them to sort of vanish, is extraordinary. And I've come away with 2 conclusions. The first is, it'll be very hard to take this lot seriously ever again, because it's
100%. 100%.
But the second conclusion I've come to is that actually Rishi Sunak's premiership is slightly more fragile, slightly more damaged than I thought at the beginning of the week, and there are 2 reasons for that. Okay, and one of them is going to require a little bit of a knotty looking at the numbers.
Okay.
One of the big arguments that's been had today was government ministers trying to reassure the rebels that in the event that there was one of these kind of short notice injunctions from the Strasbourg court to stop a plane taking off, then absolutely, definitely they would change the rules that civil servants have to operate by in order to make sure that all the civil servants didn't follow the instruction of the international court, but instead the flight could still take off, right? And Michael Tomlinson, the minister, made a whole load of promises at the dispatch box. And then the big vote earlier this evening on an amendment had 65 Tory MPs basically go, we don't believe you.
Was this the generic amendment?
This was the generic amendment. So what happened was all day long there was a negotiation. The government came up with a compromise, and 65 Tory MPs said, blew a raspberry at it. Now, almost all of them then abstained or voted for the bill later on. But they literally, this is a quarter. It's 60 out of 340 essentially. Saying we simply do not believe the things that your ministers are saying at the dispatch box. So that is a big change, right? And it's just because we don't want to lose our own seats at a general election are we going along with your plan? And then also because it's been a big week in Tory politics, I've been going around talking to people, and in bits of the Conservative Party that I thought would, sort of concede it wasn't great, but more or less have Rishi Sunak's back, because who else and why, and wouldn't it be insane to change leader now? I've just been detecting, the conversation when I go, but surely you can't change leader. expecting, my God, no, that would be ridiculous. You can't have number 4 in this parliament. That's not the... But, Neil, that's not the answer I get back.
I know.
That's not the answer I get back. Not from the rebels, but from other bits of the party. They go, well, I'm not for a leadership contest at the moment, but I can see it happening, and it wouldn't be the end of the world.
Okay, but given the fact that the rebels on this occasion, I was going to say they were all talking no trousers, but that's not quite right. They might not have trousers on, but they're in short shorts. Okay, if on an occasion such as this, they bottle it. Or perhaps don't bottle it, and we refer back to your analysis a moment ago. I mean, how fair is it to describe the Conservative Party as deeply divided when, on an occasion such as this, Rishi Sunak comes out victorious?
Incredibly fair, right? Because the reason for the apparent unity and that is a pragmatic, some would say extraordinarily cynical calculation by rebels that it's not worth collapsing the government, and also, bottling it, possibly, but also this is about positioning for after an election when the Conservatives are in opposition. But we need to talk about the nature of that division, Neil, because it's not. We always like to talk about politics about personality. It's really not. All the challenges to Rishi Sunak's flagship piece of legislation are about one thing. They're sliced and diced in different ways. The amendments all look different. They all sound like they're about different things. They're not. They're about one thing and one thing only, and that's the fact that the European Court of Human Rights applies and can basically enforce certain human rights laws, and that enforcement can come as a result of decisions by the Strasbourg Court. Right? There is a 65-strong group of Tory MPs that thinks that's wrong. And I think pretty much most of them would like Britain to withdraw, to follow Belarus and Russia, and withdraw from the European Convention of Human Rights, thinking it's out of date and stops us controlling our own borders, right? And there's a much bigger number of Tory MPs who either don't want that or aren't willing to fight on that ground at the moment. And that is an absolutely kind of crossable cavern between two bits of the Tory party. Here's where we get to why it's fundamentally broken, if I'm being honest. It's fundamentally broken because there is 60 MPs who believe one thing, 280 that believe another, and there is no overlap between those two groups. And the European Convention of Human Rights is not the only thing that's true. One of the things that has really struck me over the course of this 4.5 long years of a parliament, the Conservative Party sort of really struggle to have an economic policy. I mean, what's the priority? Is it growth? Is it tackling the deficit? Is it tackling inflation? Is it repairing, the sort of the public services? At one point in this parliament, it was spending more money on, on lots of bits of public services. It's not that now. But the Conservative Party doesn't have a guiding star. In terms of policy, not least because it's changed legislation, and those divisions, not really about people, although there are human faces to it, is the reason the party is really, really struggling with itself at the moment.
Sam, given it is almost the witching hour here in Westminster, why don't you sit back, rest on those laurels of yours after almost calling the vote exactly right, prognosticator of prognosticators. We will be back in just a moment when, thankfully having Sam here, we'll be asking what happens next. Welcome back. We are still in the small cubbyhole that we call the podcast studio here in our Westminster offices, just a short distance away from Parliament. Sam Coates, our deputy political editor, has had a slurp of tea, so is ready to discuss exactly what is coming next. I mean, obviously, the very beginning of this podcast, I suggested all that needs to happen next is for the King to put his signature to it. That's obviously not true. It's into the Lords where, two things strike me. One, they're going to rip it to shreds. And two, we've also been hearing from the Lords today on the matter of the Rwanda Treaty, and they're not happy about that either.
Yeah, for the next 6 weeks, this bill is going to be in the Lords. The first kind of test, the first indication we'll get of what the Lords think of it will be when it has its own what's called a second reading debate on the principles of the bill. That'll probably be in the last week of January. We'll get to voting at probably sometime in mid-February. It'll come out of the Lords probably in March. And the question is, does it come out in anything like the form that would be acceptable to the government? And we know the answer to that. We know that the Lords have an awful lot of lawyers who who will have strong views about things like that bit of the bill that says Rwanda is a safe country. Legislating to say white is black in the view of some people, and have views about international law. Anyway, once it comes out, if it comes out in a form that the government doesn't like, comes to the Commons, and then the government will use its majority to strip out all the bits it doesn't like and send it straight back to the Lords. Mm-hmm. And there is a process known gloriously as ping pong, which would take place in March, where the Commons will do that, and then it is up to the Lords whether they decide they're gonna put those clauses back in, and then bing, Commons takes it out, bang. The Lords puts it back in, boing, the Commons takes it back, and I can't think of enough more kind of like sonorous tones, but you get the idea.
Whiff-waff.
And in the end, one side has to back down, and that side will probably be the Lords. But the point about this is, it's just like, I hope you're looking forward to many more late nights like this in the studio, Neil, because they're coming, and they're coming around this. It means that this is going to go on and on and on and on, and then once that bit's done, and we've got through all of that process, and it comes out of the Commons the other side, then, and it has royal assent, then we learnt this morning, ministers think it'll take months for the first flight to take off. So, it could get royal assent in mid-March, optimistically. It might end up being a little bit later. That might be April, might May. Does that mean before the summer? And then at that point, the next set of hurdles is whether or not the courts accept. The whole point of this bill is to try and stop the courts from interfering in this, domestic and foreign. And, the government's own legal advice is that there was a 50-50 chance of this legislation, as it currently is conceived, working. The Tory rebels got involved, got stuck in because they think there's almost no chance of it working. That's when we find out, right?
Are we? Here's one for you, Sam. Are we, the media, perhaps a little bit complicit in all of this? Are we not doing that which Rishi Sunak would like? I mean, ultimately, we have spent, the past 20 minutes talking about the legal ramifications, the political nuances of all of this, of a piece of legislation that if, and it's a capital letters in neon if, it ever makes it onto the statute book, would result in, at best, a handful of illegal immigrants, according to the government, in inverted commas, being deported to Rwanda. All of this effort that is being expended on a piece of legislation that will accomplish, if it is successful, incredibly little. I mean, Yvette Cooper opened her kind of closing statement in the debate today by describing this as a farce. And I'm wondering, objectively, whether there might be some truth in that.
Certainly the polling about the Rwanda policy doesn't suggest that the public is overwhelmingly in favour of it. I mean, it all depends on whether it works, and we just cannot know whether the essential idea at the heart of this legislation works. The kind of nucleus of this bill, of this plan, is the idea that people who have travelled through Central Asia, have travelled through, fought their way through Eastern Europe and Central Europe, and suffered through Northern France with all that food, and then made the crossing to the actually suddenly go, do you know what? That policy is the thing that's going to put me off. If they even know about it, that's the gamble. And the government say, well, look what we're doing in Albania, because there are people being returned there. And they say, look, if that's a deterrent, but it's not. It is fundamentally different. Here you have people that have risked their lives travelling across continents with potentially nothing. Are they sitting there going, do you know what? If at third reading the Lord says this, and the courts agree, and and Jacob Rees-Mogg doesn't disagree, then I'm not going to pick up the. I mean, that's. Is there going to be a moment where you can say that legislation materially stopped people coming to the UK? Well, I think that's the calculation that voters are going to have to make.
Sam, I look forward to spending a lot more late nights in your company in this small, cosy room. For now, though, thanks very much indeed.
Pleasure.
And that is your lot for this late edition of the Sky News Daily. We'll be back again tomorrow.